this morning on the new espresso machine. It was great.
Oh, hey.
What's up?
Hey, we're live. Hey, this is Joe Morocco,
I'm Eliza Lovett.
and we are here at Mill City Roasters to bring you some more coffee education today.
Welcome.
Welcome. We were just talking about some weird roast curves and how to kind of trick out a coffee that may be outside of the bounds of what normal coffee is. A lot of times when we're just roasting those washed mild
Curds.
coffees, as we've been learning they're called,
Washed
they may roast in a very set way, but when you get a big Pacamara that's a natural, you may have to change things up a little bit.
Yeah, or those wacky honey process.
That's right.
Lots
So
of fun.
today we're going to talk to you about air again, and how we use airflow in the roaster, and how we can, go a little deeper into airflow so that we can get more out of our coffee. So today, Eliza is going to be helping me out, keeping me from going into the weeds too far, and asking questions that maybe I'm not anticipating too much. So again, if you're at home, feel free to ask your own questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully get to those. But we had some discussion around airflow, and it has since sparked a lot of questions coming to us about airflow that maybe in our first airflow video we didn't get too in-depth on. So we want to clear that out and see if we can reset on airflow.
Okay.
Do you have any initial questions for us today, or should I just dive right in?
I'll start with the question that I get asked all the time.
Okay,
Just gonna go right for it.
go for it.
Yeah. Why do we use airflow? Why do we moderate these changes, and why do we do this?
That's a
Why do we
very good
care?
question. So as I began to roast coffee, I was taught that airflow was a heat application source. We know that it's a resource for heat. We know that convection is a more economical way of heating. It actually will heat coffee much more quickly than conductive heating will. Conductive being that heat of touch, the transfer of heat from when one thing that is hot touches something that is cooler. Well, this is air that is hot touching the coffee that is cooler as the air moves through the drum, usually off of the burner set. I was also taught that we are not supposed to touch that, that we just allow that airflow to kind of roll through. And this is more of an old school way of thinking about heating coffee. A lot of your older roasters don't really have airflow control, or if they do have airflow control, it's in some kind of set point, like 1, 2 set point, where you have it 50% and a set point to where you have it totally off. And I wanted to talk about that for a minute. So if you have your vent pipe, and that vent pipe, this is a vent pipe, and the air is moving through this pipe, right? And you have a damper. And that damper is made to kind of flip up and down. So as you move the damper in one direction or the other direction, it's going to tighten around the pipe. So then that means that the air now has to go around that damper in order to continue out of the pipe. Well, a lot of times we think about, oh, thank you, Nick with the save. A lot of times
Pink?
I love pink. A lot of times we think about when we have this set at 100%, which is what we think of as being fully open, that air is moving through at 100%. That would be correct. But we think that then when we set it to 50%, that air is now moving at 50%. And that's really not correct. Because what air likes to do is maintain speed and just tighten. So the air will just tighten as it goes through this space. And as it tightens, it just goes around real quickly and may slow down a little bit, but that's not really a big enough adjustment to make an impact in the drum. We're not really stifling airflow until we get quite a bit closed. And then that airflow starts to kind of have back pressure back into the drum. That's when we start seeing our airflow slow down. And on a regular damper system, there's really no way to tell whether or not that is at 50% or if it's at 25%, there's really no way to tell. So that's why on the machines here at Mill City, instead of it being a damper system, and a lot of other roaster manufacturers are kind of moving toward this kind of a system, the fan itself, which is usually a fan that has like blades that go this way, and the fan is moving like this, so it's pulling air through the system, we can slow that fan down or speed that fan up. You'll hear me talk about 100% airflow, 50% airflow, 25%, you know, throw out these random percentages. And that is if you have a dial, which on the North machine, I'll just use that as an example, you'll have a dial that kind of goes from 0 to 100, and then 100 is what we think of as 100%. But on any given roast, it may be the case that 70 is going to be the fastest that your airflow will go, and 30 may be the slowest that your airflow may go. So, which I know that's not exactly 70-30. But as you turn that dial, your fan speed goes faster and faster, and you're able to pull more air through that system or less air through that system. And that measurement is actually real. So whenever I say for this roast, you should go to 100% airflow at this certain time, 100% would be the marker 70 for that. So that would be equals 100% for that particular roast. And then whenever I say 0%, that would equal 30 for that particular roast. Because if you go below this on the North machine, you're not going to pull enough oxygen into your burner area so that your burners will stay lit. Your burners will, or your fire will start drifting off of the burners, and they'll start using the air that's coming into the panel as their source of oxygen. So you'll start seeing this drift, and that's not a very safe thing. So you want to keep airflow moving enough to where you're still feeding that flame and keeping the flame set. And also another really good thing to keep in mind that Steve reminded me about today as I was speaking about this is if you turn your airflow completely off, if it's at 0, then at 0, you are now issuing a lot of gas and NOx fumes into the system, and that's going to push its way into the coffee itself. It's going to push its way into that, or it can push its way into your drum, which is a very unhealthy thing. It can be a very unhealthy thing. And then if you have your burner, let's pretend this is a roaster here, and this is your burner under here. So in your burner box, if this air starts, getting gas that it cannot catch flame, and that gas starts moving into your drum, and then all of a sudden you do open up your airflow and pull air through, now all of a sudden that oxygen can hit that fuel, and you might have a burst of flame in your drum itself. So you want to be very careful in the beginning of your roast that you don't go too low on airflow, because if you go too low, you can cause a lot of other issues. So when I say 0%, know that I'm talking about 0% for a particular roast. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay.
Now, here's a real question though.
Okay.
What about this 100%?
Uh-huh. So this is a great lead-up question.
Can there be too much air, perhaps?
There can. So this is something that when Rob Host was here a couple weeks ago, he was talking about, and it left a lot of people with some questions that I'm going to revisit, not to put words in his mouth or say he's right or wrong or anything, but just to further explain what his explanation was. So a lot of roasters have been engineered, and especially your more historical roasters, to where when you are at a full open airflow, or what we would call 100% for the machine, that at that point you are bringing in maximum energy from your flame. So here you have your flames, they're burning. This burner box, this set of flames, has a certain number of BTUs that it can maximize, that it can reach as a maximum level. So let's just pretend this number is 10,000 BTUs, okay? So if this flame can create 10,000 BTUs, then I can correlate a fan that at 100% speed, or whatever the power of that particular engine is, that fan will pull 10,000 BTUs off of the burners and into the drum. Okay? So now, if that fan were to go higher than that, let's say the fan were to move capacity beyond what 10,000 BTUs can heat. So let's say if there's a certain number of cubic feet of air, that's what this is going to be. Let's say that like 150 cubic feet of air being pulled across this burner in any minute. So this is hypothetical. That 10,000 BTUs can heat this to 500 degrees efficiently. But now all of a sudden I have a fan that can pull more than 150 cubic feet of air through that space. So if my fan is more powerful than what this burner has the capacity to heat in the amount of time that it takes to pull that air through, now all of a sudden, if I can turn my fan up higher and higher and higher, let's say turn it up to 11, if we can turn it up to 11, then all of a sudden, this 10,000 BTUs is not enough to heat it to 500 degrees. So what if I have a fan that is able to go up to 300 cubic feet per minute? Now, instead of having the capacity to heat to 500 degrees, I might only have the capacity to heat to 300 degrees. Well, 300 degrees is cooler than where I want my coffee to go. So what Rob was talking about, I'm going to lose the roaster. I know this is beautiful. I'm sorry. I'm going to lose the roaster for a minute. So what Rob is talking about is if you have a fan that is super efficient at pulling in air and a system that's super efficient to pulling that air through, that ability to heat is a bell curve. So as your fan is low, you're not pulling in energy through convection, or maybe very little energy. As you turn your fan up, you're pulling in more and more energy off of your burner. And then as you turn your fan up more and more, now all of a sudden you're pulling so much air in that your burner doesn't have the ability to stay caught up with the amount of airflow. So on a North machine, we certainly have a very, very high efficiency fan. And so you're able to find this kind of a bell curve that exists. What a lot of your more traditional roaster manufacturers did was they only put in a fan that was maxed out. So you cannot use the fan to pull in cool air, which I kind of like because you can use it as a brake system.
Yeah.
You can pump a little cold air if you want to slow the coffee down. Whereas this, you have to pull off of the air, but that doesn't necessarily cool the system down. You have to wait for then the metal to cool itself down, because now you have less movement through the system and that metal will hold on to heat even more. So you can't use it as a brake system. So for a North machine, you can use airflow as a brake system because you have the full gamut of not pulling in energy to pulling in way more air than the burner is able to keep up with, because that air is just pumping through very quickly into your system. If you think about air moving from the outside of a drum to the inside of a drum in a matter of a couple of seconds, there's no way that that flame is going to be able to heat that air appropriately for that space. So, furthermore, that means that hypothetically there could be a setting on your airflow where you are maybe not bringing in maximum efficiency of air and temperature, but you're in a place to where in the beginning of your roast, you're not stifling energy too much, but then at the end of your roast, you're still allowing for enough energy to where hypothetically you could find one air setting for an entire roast. So that's what Rob is meaning whenever he says that he doesn't adjust airflow a lot on a regular drum roaster. Obviously, if he's roasting on a Loring, he's adjusting it all the time because it's set with the gas. But on a regular roaster, he does not worry about this too much. So when you think about adjusting airflow, I want you to think about it in terms of whether you're converting over to convective energy or sticking with conductive energy as the energy source that you're using to heat your coffee. We prefer, oh yeah, go ahead.
You used a really great word that leads me to a really vital question that I get a lot in class.
Okay.
You said switching the source from conductive to convective.
Yes.
Can we speak to that for a moment? Because people often ask, well, if we're using mostly convection in this roast, why are we starting with the airflow so low?
Yeah. So if you are using low airflow in a roast, by nature of using low airflow, your energy that is going to be moving from your system to the coffee, that heat that the coffee is absorbing, is going to be coming through the metal of the drum more than it's coming from the air, because the air is not moving that much. And
why is that important, though, in the beginning of the roast?
It's a good question. So this is what we talked about in the first episode that we talked about airflow. I want to say maybe 2 years ago, actually. So what you have is the seed that is, 12% moisture. In the beginning of your roast, by affecting it with energy that is low efficiency, the seed is able to absorb that energy in a slower manner, to where the evaporative process is not moving as quickly. And so the moisture that is in this coffee is able to then pull that energy into the core of the seed much more slowly and efficiently. And for a really dense coffee that wants to pull energy in very quickly, it's also wanting to expel H2O very quickly. That's wanting to pull out. And so what happens when that pulls out is you'll get a layer around the outside of the coffee that is more dry than the core. This dry layer then acts as an insular layer that prevents energy from moving through as efficiently. But then once energy is in, now the H2O that is here, that's horrible, the H2O that is here is under pressure. And so now it's not able to move out as efficiently as it would have if we would have moved energy more slowly in. So if we move energy more slowly in, basically what happens is energy moves in, moisture moves out in a nice slow fashion. It's kind of like if you're in a crowded bar and somebody yells fire and there's only one exit and everybody in the bar has to exit out of that one place, all of a sudden you have a traffic jam, a lot of pressure, things get hurt. That's what happens in coffee. But if you leave the building in a nice orderly fashion, then everybody can move out of the building safely and you have affected the change that you want to in that system.
Gotcha.
So we need low efficiency heat, and conduction is a lower efficiency heat. However, that's not to say that there's no convection in the beginning of the roast or that there's no conduction in the end of the roast. Both of these heat transfer methods still exist throughout the entire experience of roasting. However, we're leaning into conduction in the beginning of the roast by slowing our airflow, and we're leaning into convection later in the roast. Well, why do we want to do that? Well, once we have gotten rid of a lot of the water, or at least set up a system to where this water can now more easily and more smoothly evacuate the seed, now we can hit it with efficient heat, and that efficient heat is needed to create Maillard reaction and caramelization. If we hold H2O in the coffee, then Maillard reaction can't happen, caramelization can't happen. If caramelization is trying to happen, that H2O molecule will start trying to break off of your carbohydrate molecule, which that's caramelization on a molecular level, but then it'll meet other H2O. And so it's not as efficient at breaking off. And so that molecule, instead of breaking off the H2O, might break off another segment of the molecule, like a carbon dioxide segment or something like that. And instead of you getting a simplified sugar, you might get another molecule that is tasteless to us or that, tastes bad. So, does that make sense? Cool. So, again, revisiting this in terms of, for those of you that are specifically on a North machine, what we talk a lot about on roasting on the North is on that dial that you have that starts at 0 and ends at 100, between the 70 and the 30 mark, this range is really kind of where you want to be for most of your air adjustments. If you're going into this segment here, you're probably bringing in too much cold air. You can use this as a brake system to slow your roast down if your roast starts getting out of hand. To go into this segment here, you're probably not bringing in enough air. This is at near 0, or your fan may even turn off. And in reality, if you have the drum completely devoid of coffee, then you'll see that your fan in this range is still spinning and still moving air through the system. However, when you add coffee into that system, now you're stifling the airflow through the system. So now the fan needs to be ramped up to that 30 number, which is arbitrary to RPMs, but just think about it in terms of the number on the dial. That needs to be ramped up in order to have the force to still pull air through that system. So this is kind of your happy place where you want to live. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I have my sort of general theory for my cupping roast.
How do you approach that?
So I start at 30, and then around those Maillard reactions, once I start seeing yellow, that's when I start increasing air, and then maxing out around first crack.
Okay.
I've heard some different thoughts on that, and I've also heard, there are people who will max out around first crack and then bring it back, or they will, again, go a little bit over that 100% to pump the brakes, if you will, and then bring it back when the coffee becomes endothermic again. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I'm going to draw a line here. There are a lot of theories on this, and in all reality, none of these theories is wrong or right. It could be the case that a particular coffee reacts better to one of these theories, and another coffee may react worse to one of these theories. So it's important to kind of keep your options open. But in general, my approach is low airflow until I start seeing browning reaction, and then I go to whatever my 100% is for that particular roast. So in general on a North, I would start at 30, and then once I see browning, I would go to 70 immediately. Those would be my only adjustments that I would make during the entire roast. You want to make sure also across the board that your airflow is either off or very low when you drop coffee into the roaster, because that air can pull beans back. Generally as you drop it through the hopper, it's going to cross the air that's flowing out. So if you have your fan really high when you're dropping coffee, when you're charging your roast, that will suck some green beans back into your chaff can, which is a waste. So we don't want to do that. But generally, I'll be at 30 when I start the roast, and I'll be at 70 when I end the roast. Now on a ProBot, I will be probably at 0 when I start the roast, and I'll be at 100% by the time I start seeing browning reactions. If I am roasting a coffee that is really dense and really moist, then I will probably stage up my airflow as that coffee is roasting. If I have a coffee that is really low density and not very moist at all, I may not go down to 30. I may be at a higher efficiency heating much earlier because I know that I need to push energy into that coffee, and I don't have to worry about moisture in that coffee as much.
What about a low density but large screen size? How would you approach that?
So I would probably approach it with pretty high efficiency heating. So I would want to really pump in some energy into that coffee through the airflow. And I'd probably do that a little bit more up front, and then I might relax that coffee as it's going through the Maillard reaction, give it some space and time to really go through development of flavor. And then I might allow it to kind of speed up as we're getting close to the end of the roast.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Cool. So I hear you saying you mainly make this one great sweeping adjustment.
Generally.
Yes. Which, I mean, everything, as we learned from Rob, is like, there are no set answers in coffee roasting.
Correct.
But you were talking about with a higher density bean, you would make incremental adjustments. Why would that be? You want to slow down the transfer of heat to that coffee?
Yes. If you have energy that is springing into the coffee very quickly, which density, this is a actual rule of physics. Higher density equals faster transfer.
Yeah, more stuff to conduct.
That's right. Lower equals slower. So if you have metal, energy will move through metal very quickly. If you have water, energy will move through it kind of quickly. If you have air, energy moves through it very slowly. If you have space, energy doesn't move through it, except for in the form of light waves or some, I'm trying to think of the third kind of heating. Sorry.
Infrared?
Infrared, yes. Infrared energy will move through space. But you won't have heat transfer through any kind of material. So the more dense your material is, the faster your heat transfer. The lower your density is, the slower that heat transfer. So if I have a low density coffee, I need to compensate for the slower amount of energy or the slower movement of energy by being more efficient on that. However, conversely, I need to compensate for the high and fast transfer of heat on a dense coffee by slowing that process down.
Right on.
Yeah. So think about your damper as how you would monitor your heat transfer. Think about density. And density, a lot of people think about density corresponding with moisture. But again, these two things are different. If a coffee has more moisture, it will be more dense. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a coffee reading more moisture is more dense. You could have a very high moisture, low dense coffee. So think about how moisture content in the coffee correlates to density in the coffee, and then how you want to represent that coffee on the table, and then use your heat transfer methods of your damper or your fan speed. And we like fan speed because it's a lot more accurate to measure and to control and to repeat. Do we have any questions coming in?
How does the increase of airflow affect the rate of rise?
So the question is, how does the increase of airflow affect the rate of rise? Well, that is going to depend. If you have airflow that at maximum is also maximizing your heat, then the more you increase your airflow, the more you increase your rate of rise. If you have airflow that will eventually decrease the amount of heat that you bring in, so on the other end of that bell curve, then you will see your rate of rise increase as you increase air, but then it will start decreasing as you increase air further, because now you're pulling in too much cold air. So you have to really know your system, the particulars of your system, to see that reaction. So when conducting any kind of experiment, you want to set up all of your parameters to be the exact same, except for the one thing that you're changing. So I recommend, if you want to know on your system, use the same coffee, use the same gas setting, don't change the gas setting at all throughout the roast, and then increase your air at different speeds and see which one causes a higher or a lower rate of rise. Then you can answer your question on your system.
I guess kind of where you find that 30 and 70, like how do you find your efficiencies?
Yeah, so there's a question, where do we find the 30 and 70? On the Mill City Roaster, it will actually say 30, and it will actually say 70. On a different dial, it may be a totally different way of reading it. There may be a magnehelic way of reading it, to where you may have a dial, but then you may also have a box that is measuring the amount of electricity that is going through. And so it may be a different setting, to where this is, showing one number here, and then as you increase your airflow, it may move the needle to another area. So that's why on your system, you need to figure out where your 100% for a full batch of coffee is, where your 100% for a half batch of coffee is, and kind of go from there. Every system's just so different.
How does airflow influence flavors?
Ooh, so this question is, how does airflow influence flavors? Well, that is the question. Every coffee has its own set of potential flavors that you, the roaster, have to worry about unlocking. Airflow and changing airflow is going to change the way that you unlock those flavors for that particular coffee in your particular system. So what I do on a North machine to a natural Pacamara may be different than what you might do on a Loring for a natural Pacamara, for instance. So the way that we manipulate airflow through a system is going to vary depending on that system. So it may be the case that we do very different things with airflow on very different machines for the same coffee and get a very similar taste result. At the end of the day, we like to say that the machine is not where you make, it's not what sets a coffee apart, but it's how you manipulate the machine that's what sets the coffee apart. The individual coffee has all of these potentials, and then you can use all of these systems to pull those potential flavors that you want out of the coffee. So on one machine, having faster airflow may cause more citrus. On another machine, slowing airflow down may cause more citrus. There's no set answer to that question, I'm sorry. You have to experiment.
Although there is definitely a way to impart flavor with lack of airflow.
This is true. Talk to me about this.
Well, so, if you're into that nice, smoky, lovely aroma roast, if you will, you can just knock that airflow back towards the end of the roast. You could roast something super light. All those pores are open towards the end of the roast. There's a lot of smoke in the drum. So if you want that light, fruity, naturally processed Costa Rica to also taste like smoke, you can knock your airflow down, keep the smoke in the drum, and still drop it at that light drop point you want to. Still get the fruit and also have a really interesting smoke note.
That's right. Yep. And if you want a super clean coffee, you can also blast air through at the end of the roast. Opposite. Now, what some people, I have heard admonishment to too much airflow at the end of the roast, that it could pull some of the volatile aromas off of the coffee. I haven't seen that scientifically proven, but I think that there's a potential for that.
Experienced that myself, but I guess anything's possible.
Anything's possible. The world is yours. I think that basically sums it up for this week. Do you have any last words for us or thoughts on airflow? All right, great. Well, keep your questions coming. Again, your questions are what kind of drive where we go with this series, and we need to have a lot of leadership in what you guys are thinking out there, and what questions we can answer, and we'll try to keep the information flowing. Thank you. See you next month.